That's what I mean. It's not going to go live, is it? It's been really temperamental. I've come off the Wi-Fi. I've gone on Wi-Fi to see if it. Right. Okay. Is that the link? Oh, is that the link? No. Where's the link? Where's the link?
Absolutely no idea. What?
It's like that's not a link, is it? It's the YouTube. What's?
Looks like a forward or something, doesn't it?
Yeah. Oh, this is not helpful. Ah, okay.
Okay.
Right, I know, but nothing's open now. It's like.
Do you want me to go away? I mean, I think you know. I don't think there's anything that you missed there.
No.
You know far more about streaming than I do. You do it every week.
Everything is absolutely. I said it was all super slow, didn't I? Before.
That's why I think you probably would have been best to reboot.
Oh, it's working now. Well, I don't know what's working though because I'm on a different link. Am I?
Who's
Beth has just said working now.
Working?
Yeah, but I don't know how it can be working because what is going on now? I can't. It's just everything is so slow. We can see and hear you. You can see and hear me, but I'm not on the same thing. Oh, right. Okay. Right. That's Claire. Oh, just everything's just on absolute go slow. Claire, can you hear me? Because it just says that one person's on. I can hear you now. We can see and hear you. This is really weird. So, okay, brilliant. Thank you. I started a new stream, so I'm really confused now. So, and it only looks like one person's watching, but presumably loads of you are. So I'm sorry about that. Let's see if we can make some progress. This is a bit stressful, isn't it? Okay, totally fine. I can hear you. Brilliant. Honestly, you are the best audience ever for letting me do this. Okay, so I stopped at the end of chapter verse 11. So here we go. So in verse 12, it says, "Do not be afraid, since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding, I have come in response to them." That's fine. So I will just keep going. So from Daniel's point of view, he has devoted himself to prayer, to seeking the face of God for an answer. But from his point of view, for 3 whole weeks, nothing much is happening. And there is no obvious answer at all. And to be honest, it's hard keeping on praying, isn't it? It's hard keeping on focused like Daniel did. And he just carried on. Thanks, Joe. He carried on praying and committed to God and seeking him. But nothing seemed to be happening. Nothing seemed to be happening. And from the messenger's perspective, which is a really important bit, yes, that's the one. Brilliant. Fantastic. Oh, okay. Fantastic. Praying seems to work. I know. I did think to myself, it's interesting what we're talking about that tonight, isn't it? Very interesting. So I've just got to get my brain in gear now. The messenger says, no, it's not like you see it. And we have this very blinker perspective, don't we? That what we see and experience is everything there is. And the messenger comes on and says, from the very first day that you began to pray. And we're not told in this particular verse that it's Gabriel, but it sounds really like him because he uses almost the exact same words that he used last week. Daniel, you who are highly esteemed. And that's what we saw last week as well. You who are highly esteemed, greatly loved. It sounds just like the words that Gabriel used last week. And it's just incredibly encouraging, isn't it? Because even though Daniel hasn't experienced it, God has heard him from the start and God is sending his answer. And we don't always turn to prayer as the first thing that we turn to, do we? I mean, you know, we know that we should, and when we do pray, we know that it was a good idea, but sometimes we try and figure things out for ourselves, and sometimes we forget to bring things to God in prayer. But from the very moment that Daniel began to pray, something started to happen in heaven. From the very first moment he started to pray, something happened in heaven. And I was trying to think of an illustration, and it took me right back actually to when I was at Bible college. And there was a lady who wasn't in my class, but she used to cycle to and from the college. And on this particular, I think she had young kids. And on this particular day, when she'd gone off cycling home, she'd had an accident on her bike. And as a result, she had fallen off and hit her head on the pavement. And she'd been taken to hospital unconscious, and with all of the likely injuries and uncertainties that come with a head injury. And I was at that point the prayer secretary for the whole college. And we gathered together. I remember it like it was yesterday, really. We gathered together and we prayed in a room in the college, and we prayed because, you know, it was obviously really serious. And there's some point, maybe around 11:30 at night, something like that, and we suddenly went, oh, you know, maybe we should kind of, you know, praise God and sing. And it wasn't like a presumptuous thing. It was just a moment where it just felt like the atmosphere had changed. And so we began to do that, and just felt a real overwhelming sense of peace. As you can imagine, because I'm telling you this story, it had a happy ending, and it really, really had a sense that God had intervened in that moment, and that actually at that point things had changed, and we didn't need to be praying in the same way that we'd started off praying. Now, that's not always our experience, is it? And there have been plenty of times when it hasn't been my experience either. But there are those moments where we just have a sense that there's a bit of a delay from the beginning to when we sense that God is really intervening, but we know that that's happened. And, you know, in our case it was several hours, and this, in Daniel's case, it was 3 weeks, and sometimes it's significantly longer than that. But we just have a sense that actually God has heard us, even though we don't see the immediate answer. And these words in Daniel reveal how Daniel's attitude is judged by the heavenly realms. And, you know, it really doesn't matter what other people see in us. I mean, it's obviously nice if they see good things, but really, at the end of the day, that is not the most important thing. And here we have Daniel, who's been really high up, you know, top level in the kingdom of Babylon and then Medo-Persia, and yet actually the main thing is that he's highly esteemed by God. And verse 12, do not be afraid, since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before God, your words were heard, and I've come in response to them. And there is just this overwhelming sense throughout Daniel that this man, Daniel, is a humble man, and that heaven is watching him, and that's the most important thing. He is, it says, humble yourself in 1 Peter 5, doesn't it, beneath God's mighty hand, so that he may lift you up. And here's Daniel, who's walked his whole life with kings and emperors, but it hasn't gone to his head, that God sees his heart, and he knows that in his heart he is still a humble man who knows that actually before God his position is on his knees. And as he prays, he experiences, and we'll see this in the next few chapters, what God says in Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 20, that he is able to do immeasurably more than we ask or even imagine. And the answer that God gives to Daniel is a big picture answer, isn't it? It's not just an answer to what's happening with my people in Jerusalem. As we've seen with these previous visions, it's a big picture answer. And God listens to the prayers of his people. He will not do always exactly what we ask him to do, because he sees the big picture. He sees how the whole thing works together, and we very often only have our bit of the jigsaw, don't we? And we're looking at our bit, we're trying to work out, is it, a chrysanthemum, or is it a carrot, or is it a part of the seashore? We can't decide. And God's looking at the big picture all of the time and how all the bits fit together. And so prayer is really important. And if there's ever a passage about prayer, this is one of those. It's also, the next thing really is that life is much more complicated than we can always see or know. Because in verse 12, Daniel prays and God listens and sends an answer. But the prince of the Persian kingdom resisted the messenger, and then Michael was sent to help him. And, I know I'm kind of talking to the converted on this chat probably, but there is a heavenly realm, isn't there? There's something that we don't see. There's a realm beyond this world. And we have a tendency to become very materialistic. I don't necessarily mean that we have lots of things, although that obviously can be true, but very focused on the material, on what we can see and touch. But there is a heavenly realm. We don't fully understand it, but it impacts and affects our lives. And for 21 days, there is resistance to God's messenger. And if we turn over to the passage that you're just waiting for me to read, I know, in Ephesians chapter 6. And verse 19, it talks about the armour of God. No, in fact, let's not start there. Let's start in 10. Says, finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armour of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armour of God. And then we're maybe familiar with that. Verse 18, and pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the saints. And our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but most often it feels like it is, doesn't it? It most often is wrapped up in stuff, in people, in challenging concrete situations in our lives. And Paul reminds the Ephesian church, and through them reminds us, that our struggle is not against flesh and blood. And that's why prayer is so important, isn't it? Because prayer is the only effective weapon against the heavenly battle, rather than the earthly one. Our real battle is not what we can see in front of us, but the heavenly realms, the spiritual dimension, the rulers, authorities, and powers of darkness that impact day-to-day life. And this passage may have its parallels in Revelation chapter 12. Let's turn over to that. And verse 7. It says, and there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. There's a really kind of a similar image, similar idea, similar person, same person, Michael, in this battle against Satan, the devil, the accuser. And so cosmic conflict is not some kind of peripheral notion for over-enthusiastic Christians or others that are interested in that kind of thing. Of course, C.S. Lewis reminded believers not to overestimate the power of the evil one, the forces of darkness, so that we look for a demon under every rock. But actually, I wonder if in our context now, that the risk is more that we underestimate them. We underestimate what is going on in the spiritual realm. And therefore, perhaps we are not as motivated or committed in prayer, and I put myself in that category as well, as we might be if we had a realistic view of what is going on in the spiritual realm. So we need to be alert to the level of conflict. And I know sometimes I'm incredibly slow and not very alert, and it takes, one thing after another, after another, after another, and I think, oh yeah, I think maybe this is spiritual warfare that's going on here. And I just wish that I'd kind of been alert a little bit sooner. And sometimes I'm better at being alert, but I think the more weary we are, the more tired we are, the more subtle. Satan uses guerrilla warfare more often against out and out warfare, doesn't he? And therefore it's harder to detect. And we need to be alert to that, because we know that the enemy is not happy around evangelism. He's not happy when we seek to bring in the kingdom of light, to, bring good news to the poor, to comfort the brokenhearted and bind them up. All the things that are part of our vision as a church, to be impacting with the kingdom of light, pushing back the kingdom of darkness. He is not happy with that, and will do his best to impede God's work and to destroy or to disturb or to discourage us, to divide us from one another. And so in this passage, Daniel turns his face to the ground, and he is unable to speak again. It's just so overwhelming to him, until someone who looks like a man touches his lips in order for him to speak. And the angel is soon going to return to the fight, because this is an ongoing spiritual war against the prince of Persia at the end of this chapter. And then there's going to be this new foe, the prince of Greece. I mean, we're back in the same pattern of the visions that we've already seen. The prince of Greece, who is yet to come. But before all of that, he's going to reveal to Daniel what's in the book of truth. And so the background to this bit of the story is that Daniel's angelic messenger, so we're in about just in the last couple of verses there, Daniel's angelic messenger, Gabriel, is aided by another prince, Michael. And Gabriel says, he is your prince, the prince for the kingdom of Persia, around that area. He's that angel for that place. And Gabriel has strengthened Michael at the beginning of Darius's reign, though Daniel has not realized that. I guess we might ask were either or both of them involved in rescuing Daniel from the lions? That was right at the beginning of Darius's reign. And there is a mighty prince in a higher realm guarding his people. I personally think that it's unhelpful to overthink these things. So we have people who want to work out territorial spirits and angels for the whole earth. We are not given that level of detail in the scriptures. We are given some detail, which might lead us to believe certain things, to give us an impression of the spiritual realm and kingdoms and how things might work. But I think we need to be careful not to extrapolate that to a whole system and structure. We're not given that information, and we don't need to have it. It was particularly important for Daniel to understand what was going on in the spiritual realm because of the nature of the visions that he was to be given, to see that there was a battle going on in a different realm from the one that he found himself inhabiting. And so he's given this information about Gabriel and Michael and the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece and this battle that's going on in the heavenly realms. And so really going kind of back to the beginning, one of the things that's really important in this passage is the theme of the power of truth and of God himself, really. And it's a theme that runs through, which is kind of interesting, I think, because we tend to think that people who are deeply spiritual are somehow strong, but actually the theme that runs through this chapter is the theme of weakness. In verse 7 and 8, Daniel was the only one who sees this vision. He says, I have no strength left. My face turned deathly pale. I was helpless. Verse 10, we find that he's just about trembling on his hands and knees. Yes, Claire, I do think that. I do think that. And I think that, again, it's important we see the fulfillment of the prophetic over, I mean, I've often used this illustration as kind of the peaks of mountains. So you see the one in front of you, and as you climb over that, you see another peak that's coming next, and over that one you see another one. And I feel that that's often true with the prophetic and the visions, apocalyptic visions of scripture, that there is multiple fulfillments, of which, you know, the visions and battle of Revelation is the kind of final fulfillments, but again can be earthed sooner in history than that as well. So there's this multiple fulfillment thing going on, which is really important. I think it saves us from grounding things too much in one particular historical moment, but yet doesn't quite give us enough to do that constantly, because there's this end picture always in sight. So he's trembling on his hands and knees. Then in verse 11 he stands up, but he's still trembling. In verse 16 it says that he was overwhelmed with anguish because of the vision. He's helpless, his strength is gone, he can hardly breathe. So actually the theme here for Daniel is his weakness, and that he can't do this on his own. Even Daniel, with all that he has seen and experienced, even in that moment, having been fasting and praying for 3 weeks, he is weak. He is not going to be able to cope with what God reveals to him unless God comes and strengthens him. And so right back to the beginning, before all this that we've just talked about, in verse 4, he sees a man standing, and he's dressed in linen with a belt of finest gold round his waist. His body was like chrysolite, his face like lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and his sound like the sound of a multitude. Just unbelievable, not unbelievable, it's the wrong word to use, isn't it? But just an amazing, transcendent image. His body is incandescent with light like a jewel, his face like lightning, his eyes flaming like a torch. Just so difficult to describe, really. All these are just images, aren't they, to try to get us to have an idea. Inconceivable, that's a better word, Rob, thank you. And this man is speaking, and his voice is like the roaring sound of a vast multitude. This is overwhelming, transcendent glory. And this man, this vision of this man, is the very opposite of all that Daniel is in himself. This man is powerful. He's ready for action. This is a person with authority and power. This is like a vision of the holiness and majesty of God, and just helps us to kind of grasp again the truth of who God is, that he is much more powerful, more glorious than we can ever conceive. Yeah, that we can't get our heads around. Even our human words and descriptions just fall so short. And it always makes me think of that passage in Ezekiel, when Ezekiel tries to describe what he sees, and it's the likeness of one, and he just keeps distancing himself from the description, because somehow nothing he says is sufficient to really describe the glory of God that he sees before him. And in the Old Testament, we see that the revelation of God always precedes his purpose. So Moses encounters God at the burning bush before he is given a commission to go to Pharaoh and tell Pharaoh to let the people go. Joshua encounters the commander of heaven's armies before he is told to go into the promised land. Isaiah sees the holiness of God in the temple before he goes to speak to the people and reveal to them the purpose of God. And on each occasion, God reveals his glory and majesty. They are weak, but he is in charge. He is all powerful. And 6 centuries later, of course, in Revelation chapter 1, John sees him too. And I'm sure that you thought of these words. In verse 12 of chapter 1, I turned round to see the voice that was speaking to me. When I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. Among the lampstands was someone like a son of man. That phrase that we saw in Daniel chapter 7. Dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, and with a golden sash round his chest. His head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp double-edged sword. His face was like the sun shining in all its brilliance. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and behold, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades." It's just the same, isn't it? It's the same description. Not exactly, because it's through John's eyes, but it's the same person, one like the Son of Man. How could Daniel have seen him too? Well, that's where we have to put down our time scales, our understanding of time, that Jesus is before all things. In him all things hold together. He is outside of time, and we understand Jesus, the person within time, but Jesus, the one who is with God the Father and God the Holy Spirit, who has ever been and will ever be. And it's the same experience for Daniel, that he wasn't on his own. He seems like he had friends with him to share the burden, to pray with him, those who shared his passion for Jerusalem. But they didn't see the vision like he did. Such terror overwhelmed them that they fled and hid themselves. It kind of reminds you of Saul on the road to Damascus, whose friends and companions also fled and didn't see the vision that Saul himself saw. And Daniel is left alone to gaze at this overpowering sight of the dazzling glory of the man above the river Tigris. And his strength ebbs away. Sensory overload in some ways, isn't it? I mean, Moses was put behind a rock and he just saw the back of God passing by, and Daniel and John, they see the glory of God in an overwhelming way, and they collapse and they fall into a sleep as a result of that. And you know what? We are weak, aren't we? Even when we're strong, we're not really that strong, but often we are weak and we feel a bit overwhelmed by the experiences of our lives. It doesn't take that much to unsettle our lives. And just reminding me again this week of the fact that we just need this vision of the Lord, don't we, to sustain us. A vision of the one who's on the throne, who reigns and rules, who holds history in his hands, who knows the beginning and the end, who is the Alpha and the Omega, who holds the keys of death and hell. And that actually we don't have to be strong to have that vision of him. Daniel was weak. He was at a bit of a low ebb. He was mourning. Rob, I think it's definitely Jesus. I think I don't know. I don't know. It's a good question. I kind of feel that the one he sees and the one who touches him are not necessarily the same person. I'm having a read now. I think that the vision that he saw, chapter 10's evaporated. He said, I mean, it's not entirely clear, is it? In the same way, it's not entirely clear who's with him, who's with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. There's a kind of the man, the one like a man, this one who was standing by me. So it's not absolutely clear whether it's the man he sees, the vision of Jesus, that is the one who touches him. And then there's Gabriel. It's it's just a bit confusing, isn't it? So I guess there's a lack of clarity there. But it's the angel armies, isn't it? The Lord of hosts and the angel armies that are with him. And it's in his weakness, in his mourning, in his uncertainty that he comes to God in prayer, and he sees this vision of the Lord. And I think that's really the thing that holds us, isn't it? And it's a real encouragement to us to pray and to continue to pray with the confidence that God hears. Yeah, I think I agree, Bernard, that God hears us even when we don't see the answer immediately. And whether that's a few hours or a few days or weeks or months or years, or maybe that actually we have to wait until we see him face to face, he hears us, and there's a battle going on in heaven. And actually sometimes we just need to persist in our prayer and our hope and faith in God, because there's a battle going on in heaven and we don't see all that. We can't know it all. We just have to trust. So this is all preparation for the next 2 chapters, which will keep us on our toes again for another couple of weeks. So thank you for joining me. Thank you for everyone who's managed to come into section 2. Goodness knows what quite happened there, and hopefully other people will be. I'll try and put something on so it's clear for other people who are catching up later what they need to do. So God bless you all, and see you again soon. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for all your messages as well. Let me know what's going on. It's very, very helpful to know that. See you soon, everybody. Oh, she was fine. Thanks, Andy. Yes, she recovered and she was fine.